All right, good morning to everybody. Before we begin today, I'd really like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land I'm speaking from today and joining you from today. I respect their elders and I pay respect to their elders, past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining this call or are with us in the building today. I pay my respects and I thank them for having us here for this conversation. All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, kia ora, welcome. Thank you for joining this session. This is Body of Work, and we are here to talk about queer bodies, writing the queer body, the sexy, icky, gooey, messy, mucky, beautiful bits of having a queer body. I'd like to introduce you to the bodies or the writers who will be joining me for this conversation today. We've got a wonderful panel of queer writers with me today. I'd love to introduce you to Kaya Wilson. Kaya is a writer and a tsunami scientist, which is a beautiful combination. And his nonfiction writing blends essay and memoir, but he also explores universal themes like place and identity and gender and origin. Kaya's first book is out and it is called As Beautiful as Any Other. Thank you for being here today, Kaya.
Thanks for having me. It's an absolute delight.
It is a delight. Any conversation with you is a delight. But today we have some other people here as well. We also have the poet Emma Barnes with us today. And Emma's poetry has been published widely for more than a decade, but their first collection of poetry is out this year. They're very sexily titled I Am in Bed with You. And that was released this year, right, Emma? And you've also co-edited an anthology of Takatapui and queer writing from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Am I right with that?
Yeah, that's right. And it comes out next week. So on the 11th of November, pretty exciting.
Yeah. Oh, all right. Okay. Everybody note that down. We've got an anthology to be purchasing next week about queer voices in Aotearoa. We also
to ham it up.
Oh my, there is one that they prepared earlier, quite literally prepared that book of work for us all earlier. We also have the novelist Jennifer Mills with us today, and Jennifer is an author, an editor, and a critic. Mills's novel Dyschronia was shortlisted for heaps of awards, in particular the Miles Franklin, the Aurealis, and the Adelaide Festival Awards in 2019. Mills's latest novel is a sexy queer ghost story, and that's called The Airways, and that is also out this year. We have very prolific and busy authors on our panel today. So welcome, Jennifer. It's fabulous to be talking with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We also have Charlotte Charleston with us today, a beautiful gender fluid writer born to migrant parents. And their current writing, I love the way they've described this, is soft and tender, focusing on transformation, rebirth, quiet contentment, and inner healing. I can't wait to unpack some of that today. Their work has been published in places like the Cordite Poetry Review, SBS Voices, Archer magazine, and they've also performed their poetry in lots of places like the Melbourne Writers' Festival. Welcome, Charlotte. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. All right, let's get into this. We're talking about queer bodies today, but what does it mean to write about the queer body? Does it just mean that all of you just write sex stories all day long? What does it actually mean to write about queer bodies? Can I ask you that first, Emma?
Oh, yeah, sure. What does it mean? I mean, on the back of my book, someone who did the little epigraph for it was like, it's a bit disgusting. And I think that for me, when I'm writing bodies, it's like, you know, I feel deeply connected to fatbergs, for instance, you know, like it's not just my body, it's all bodies. It's the land as a body. It's, you know, it's everything. I think that's what it is for me.
Absolutely. And what about you, Charlotte? What does it mean to write about your body or to write about queer bodies? How does that resonate for you?
I think for me, writing about the body has definitely been an ongoing journey, and using poetry, and particularly performance poetry, as a chance to explore that. So, say there are pieces that I've written about exploring that identity with body, and then reading them back several years later and feeling that softness and change within the way in which I express and feel and what that looks like. And also, as a gender fluid person myself, seeing how that comes into my identity and not necessarily having to explicitly name it, but knowing how much it is a part of my core and there with my expression as well.
That's beautiful. I love that idea of not explicitly naming things, and maybe the tension that you feel as a writer of how much is named versus how much is you and is in there and is subtext. There is an essay from Garth Greenwell on The Guardian that I just think is so beautiful. And he's written that to write about the body is to cherish the body. When we write about something, we make art of it and we make a claim to its value. And he was writing about the queer sexual body, but I'd love to hear from you today about how much that resonates with you all. When you write about your body or the body as land or the bodies of your community, is that something that you're staking a claim to the importance of those bodies? And Kaya, I'd love to explore this idea with you a little bit. So you've written a memoir about your life, but it is also very much a memoir of your body. Was writing your memoir, was that an act of self-love? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really lovely quote that you read out. And I think you really articulated something I haven't particularly articulated myself. And when I think about my book, it really is a love letter to my body, a body that I felt very disconnected from, a body that experienced specific traumas and just something that I hadn't really connected to. So it really was an act of self-love, and it was an act of a growth of a relationship that I really started to care about more. And so absolutely, this was self-love. It's about getting to know myself. It was writing to myself and of myself, and it was such a huge part of my transition that it was about writing this body that had been so separate from me into being. Really, it sounds very dramatic, but it's really what it meant to be. Yeah.
How has writing your memoir changed your relationship with your body?
Look, it's infinitely better. It's all part of a larger process. I wrote it as I was transitioning, like socially, medically, and so it wasn't just something on its own, but it's become an expression of that time, an expression of that personal growth and personal connection. So I actually feel a lot of affection for it as a part of who I am. And it was quite something to make that public, but I still have my own personal relationship to the book, and it's something that I've really come to cherish.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love that you've used that word cherish as well. So writing as cherishing. Emma, there's a beautiful line in your poem, I'm in bed with you, and the line, it really resonated with me, and I'm going to read it out. I'm putting the pieces of myself into myself. I think I read it about 7 times when I read that line. And something about that line, it reminded me of healing and self-advocacy, but it also reminded me of the craft of writing and putting things together. I don't know if I've just gone full English high school exam and I'm reading meaning in there that's not actually in there, but I was wondering if the act of writing has changed the relationship that you have with your body as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. So a big component for me, I guess, is I live in a fat body, and fat bodies aren't treated very well in the world. And the process of both kind of getting into my body, I think fat people are often encouraged not to even experience or know what's going on in the body. And for me, writing is a real key process of that, but also connects in with PTSD and self. And so it's kind of building into the body, building the self. I don't think you went to English exam. I've got a literature criticism degree, and I vibed with it. The author's dead. You get to say what it means too. But yeah, definitely, I think that it has helped the process of reconnecting. That's also been a physical process for me. Like, I love weightlifting, and that's become part of it. And those two things together have kind of dovetailed in to get me back inside myself.
It's such
that's
an
beautiful
integral
that you've
part of
drawn that.
An integral part of mental health is what I was trying to say. Relationship to the body is such an integral part of mental health. It has been my experience, and I think that's what you were saying as well.
It's interesting, Kaya, that you jumped in on that, because when I was looking at both of your work, there is such a physicality in both of you as people, but in both of you as writers. And one of the little notes that I wrote down was Emma, weightlift, Kaya, swim, action. So it's interesting to me that this physicality is something that happens to you from both your heads, but also from your bodies as well.
Yeah. I mean, the physical world, being immersed in water or feeling your muscles move, or it makes you feel whole, it makes you feel like you're real and you're there. Which I think gender dysphoria or an othered body can make you feel like you don't really exist.
It's interesting that you use the phrase "you're real and you're there," because, Jennifer, it makes me start to think about your novels, which are otherworldly and ghostly and are existing in liminal spaces. And something that I've been thinking about is that to be the other, it always implies that there is the same, that it's a binary if we're othered. Do you think that writing these kind of spooky ghost stories or these stories that happen in other places, is that queer to you?
Yeah, look, it's not something that I've been deliberately sort of, okay, I'm going to queer storytelling. It's just the way that I am in the world makes me interested in the world in a different way to straight writers, I guess, or cis het writers. But I think that idea of inhabiting your own body as a result or as a problem that needs to be solved is what really fascinated me with the airways in particular. And I wanted to write about the body, about that problem of inhabiting the body from the point of view of someone who didn't, because I found that a really interesting proposition. So the ghost in the airways is able to hop between other bodies, basically, and those other bodies are usually unaware that they're being occupied. And through this process, the ghost is able to kind of generate some power slowly. And that wasn't something that I sort of set out to do particularly deliberately, but through the process of writing, through the process of paying this really intense attention to the body, there was some kind of, I don't know, attention has its own kind of magic for me. Through paying attention to these kind of processes, it was almost like the ghost was learning to generate itself, if that makes sense.
It does. And I also think, like, when reading about Yun, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, please correct me if I'm not. Yun is, they don't have a body, but they can jump into other bodies. And it's that absence of the body that makes us think about the body itself. What was it like writing that character that doesn't have a body? Did you connect with them differently? How do you imagine them in your mind?
Well, so they begin the story with a body. So they have a memory of having a body, but it's very lost. But I also
and their body's violently taken from them, right? Like that is when they start to exist in that life force. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an act of violence there that I sort of skim over quite deliberately. But for me, it was a really frightening proposition to not have a body, but it was also very, very exciting. It was a fantasy almost of being able to disappear and become other people. I mean, why else would somebody be a fiction writer? really. And a couple of reviewers have noticed that the book kind of operates as a metaphor for what fiction is capable of, because you're able to sort of jump from character to character. Yeah, I think it was that kind of space between fear and fantasy that made it very interesting to me.
It's interesting to me too, and it's interesting to me we're here today as people who are talking about our bodies and writing about the queer body. And when is it ever possible to actually write about your own body from your body? So not from your head, but coming from your body. And Jennifer's novel and work made me think about that, because the removal of the body makes it so present. But Charlotte, I'd love to hear from you about your experience as a performance poet. Like, is that something that you feel truly in your body? Like your beautiful melanin monologue talking to your teenage self and talking about Rihanna's foundation shades. Where do you feel that when that's something that you're writing or something that you're performing?
I think what it is, I feel it very much at my core, so right in that center. And I think the reason that it feels that way is when I'm writing, and why I'm writing is for that inner child, for that sense of self that hasn't had space or has been pushed down in that body. So a lot of that intention comes from softness and strength, and that nurturing of the body can feel like a blanket for the inner child that needs that space. So that's where a lot of that intention comes from.
That is such a beautiful way that you have described that. A blanket for the inner child is beautiful. I'm hearing so much softness when you speak and so much tenderness. And being queer and having a queer body sometimes to me means tenderness, but sometimes it also means something that is a little bit icky or is a little bit disgusting, like your work was described to you, Emma. And a really common theme in the fat acceptance movement is this refrain that all bodies are good bodies. And I'm wondering, is that even something that feels relevant to us? Do we want to strive to be queer bodies, or are we happy being the other and being a little bit disgusting? Emma, what do you think? Because I know that fat spaces have been really important to you.
Yeah, super interesting question, and I have about 10,000 responses immediately. Like I'm sort of more heading to that body neutrality kind of thing. I think that's I've started to see evolve over the last wee while, because I'm way more connected to fat acceptance than body positivity. You know, body positivity is kind of like a sheen over the top of the real true liberation politics that fat acceptance espouses. So I'm okay with that conundrum of like my body maybe not actually being that good or being angry at it. And I do get angry at it sometimes. You know, I have a chronic illness that's progressive, and over time I'm going to have to renegotiate my relationship with my body again and again and again as it changes. And I think that's also an experience of fatness as well. Like even a fat body still changes a lot. And I think I often get stuck in that space of, I wouldn't know there was anything really wrong with my body unless other people told me about it. And I think that's the interesting bit for me is people tell me all the time that there's horrible things about my body. And I guess it's negotiating a space where I get to have my own feelings about it, but also I don't have to take on all of this other cultural idea about, you know, what my fatness does or does not do for me, or
Yeah, for sure. There's when you were talking about so much focus on, you know, body positivity or body neutrality, Bethany Rutter, a fat queer author, wrote an amazing tweet recently, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to try and capture the je ne sais quoi of the tweet, which is essentially that we've had body positivity, now body neutrality is fashionable. It's all focused on the emotions that we have towards our body, but it doesn't actually get to the meat of the structures that might exist to make living in our bodies difficult. And we have so many different intersections of what could make living in bodies difficult, whether it is age or ability or skin color or gender. All of those things we come up against structural obstacles for our body. And Charlotte, I was wondering what was coming up for you while Emma was talking, because I've read your essays around calling for greater accessibility in queer spaces. How has writing been a tool for you to explore some of those ideas?
I think it can sometimes feel like I get a chance to have that sounding board, and particularly in recognizing my own privilege in my own experience and feeling that I can find that spaces and feeling able to navigate that, and sometimes being able to step back and also reflect on what that does look like for me and how I can both have oppressions and privileges within those spaces. And really, it's not necessarily always about, for me, you know, having to give up my space, but knowing that there are other people to also pass the mic to as well.
I think it's easy for our conversation today to become quite theoretical. The body, of the body, when I'm writing about the body, queer bodies, and ignoring the fact that we are people. And Kaya, so much happens to you in your memoir. There is big meaty stuff, there's the minutiae of life, there's travel, there's swimming, there's surgery, there's transition, there's trauma, there's sex, there's love, but it's actually all happening to you. Like if Jennifer has talked about writing fiction as escape, you have written a memoir that is very much you. How much of your body did you decide to share with us?
Yeah, like, when you said is queer bodies or writing about sex, that is probably the one thing I held back on. And I would love to write more about sex. I've got a lot of great ideas. There's like this essay that I've never written, which is like the arousal of transition. And like, I think I did write a lot about sex in my own personal first draft, but I think there was a point where I needed to reconcile this was going to be made public, and there was something I needed to keep totally private. So I think what I try to share is the relationship side of it rather than the the and I also try to share the freedom of it, right? Rather than the act of freedom, which was often sexual, could be sexual. But like, it was also for me a very grounding experience. And, when I do meditate like fairly frequently, and part of that is like grounding myself in my body and recognizing where I am and what I can feel. And like reading the airways, when Yun hops from body to body, they do the same thing, which is like kind of like my meditation practice. They take a log of what's going on, and I don't know if that's a grounding practice, but that's what it felt like for me. And I actually found the book is designed to be completely discomforting, right? But like I found it particularly unnerving because I guess I'm a little bit close to feeling that disconnection from body, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm grounding myself in this new one, and then this new one, and this new one. It was like very overwhelming. So I guess like in my book, I'm trying to ground myself in the here and now. And as you were talking earlier, like this neutrality versus positivity, and I really try to protect myself from that, from the body as moral ground. I just need it to be mine, and shielded from the moral judgment that inevitably is there. Yeah.
I love the way that you've described that. Like the body is moral ground, but I need it to be mine. I think that's such a beautiful thing to say. I also absolutely love. No, please go. I was just about to say how much it makes me laugh that Kaya was talking about holding back on sex when I was literally reading a fisting scene in his book last night. So I just love that's the held back version. But sorry, Jennifer, please jump in with what you were going to say.
I was just going to say that we talk often about our bodies as though they are sort of integral units, that we have borders that begin and end at the skin. But that's not actually the case. We're social animals. We belong to families. We belong to groups. We have huge queer families. We have this enormous amount of interdependence. And I think that idea of centering yourself in the body, there's got to be a tension between that yourself and the body that belongs to a society as well. And how that belonging takes place, I was thinking, Emma, when you were speaking earlier about chronic illness, and that feeling of the tyranny of the body is very familiar as well. But it's also interesting where that intersects with life as a problem. And I think it often intersects as a problem when you have to go to work, for example, or you have to go and be responsible for somebody else. Like if my body is just my own, I can take the day off and rest. But it's not. I have to labor. I have obligations. And so we're not, we can abstract our bodies as these kind of individual things, but that's not actually the case. It was very interesting doing the edits on the airways and thinking a lot about the breath and this kind of interdependence of the breath and the way that we all share an atmosphere during the pandemic lockdowns in Italy, and just seeing this sort of realization filter through the world around me. It's very, yeah.
I guess like that protection as well is sorry, the delay is hard, isn't it? The protection, when you say we're all connected, if you go into queer spaces, we're often all on top of each other, there's that safety of allowing each other to connect by body, there's lots of tactile kind of action that's very sensual, beyond hooking up, that I think we all crave.
I'm really interested in where this conversation is going, because I think some of my thoughts had been about body versus head, and that is still so solo. It's still just one person. And Jennifer is brought up interdependence. We've also talked about bodies of the land and about being part of a greater body as well, being part of the body of work of the queer community. Jennifer, how does that resonate with you? Like, what do you see as the relationship between your body and yourself, but also your community?
I don't know. I think perhaps not in a bodily sense very much, which is maybe why I wrote this book. But I'm sort of, I've always just thought of myself as a kind of brain in a jar kind of a person, which, obviously I'm not asexual, I'm not sort of antisocial, but I'm just, I've always been quite in my head as a person. And so I think writing this novel and trying to pay attention to the body and what it was where I figured out a lot of those things. I've also been thinking a lot about this sort of communities of care and the way that queer communities can be quite good at care and can also be quite bad at it. But, we can cluster around each other when we need to support each other's bodies or minds, and that stuff, it often does come as touch, or it comes as presence, or connecting through like walking together or exercising together, that kind of looking after each other's mental health in a world that's told us that we shouldn't exist for most of our lives. That stuff's really important. So I guess as I get older, I'm more aware of those obligations to society, and then also, I hope, getting a bit better at asking for help when I need it from others. So just an awareness that there's a web that holds us, and that our relationships are essential to our being. Like, we extend through that web. We're not little units floating around in space, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And that, well, I think that learning how to ask for help and trust in reciprocity is one of the greatest challenges of being. And it's particularly becomes challenging when you're queer and you start to think that some of those support structures in a nuclear family may not exist for you and your body, as your body might change, whether it is aging or differences in ability. I loved your description of being a brain in a jar, and I think it's so beautiful that we have a brain in a jar on a panel about bodies and how we integrate that. Emma, there was a line in one of your poems called, which I think is a very horny name for a poem, Good Girl, Good Girl. But there's a line in that poem that is very brain in a jar, which is, I think so much the thinking becomes the thing. And how do you tease out the relationship that you have between brain and body, but now also this concept of a web and community and interdependence?
I mean, I'm a recovering brain in a jar. Like, I definitely very deeply felt that for a long time. So I connect with that a lot. And I think, I don't know, for me, a really transformative experience that I had was being in Sydney for Mardi Gras just last year. Which seems ridiculous that happened now, but was super transformative for me, being in the space of one of the parties that I went to there, where there were just so many naked fat people, or very, small outfits. And I was just joyous in that, right? That just felt amazing. And I think that was part of the web for me, is that connecting to other people to reconnect with myself. Like, the outfits I wore in the end, I thought they were risque, and they were risque for Wellington, but like for Sydney they were nothing, and I was like, oh wow, I'm so boring here, and that's really nice. So I think and like, Ellie, I've learned a lot from you over the years, and connecting in with communities that you've been involved in. And so there's sort of, for me, that community aspect is massive. Like, I can't be by myself. I have to be part of the web. And so often I am disconnected. So, I'm quite disconnected from my family because I'm fat and I'm queer and I'm weird. And, and so I love the web in other places. And I also deeply connect with the idea that it's really hard, and the work of maybe several lifetimes to learn to be comfortable with asking for help and to do that. That's, I think, I don't have solutions for that. I just have the deep feeling of, I get how hard that is. But yeah,
Practice, I think, like any skill.
Yeah.
There's a line in Sarah Kreislerstein's new book, The Believer, where she goes to see a therapist, and she's got various things she's working through, and the therapist says, if you could have thought your way out of this by now, you would have. And then ask her to sort of breathe and connect with her body. And I think that's I think we've all reached that point at some point in our lives, where it's like, yeah, brain in the jar worked until this point, and there's limits. You have to connect to your body to move on. Yeah.
I think, following from what Kai is saying, particularly with being mindful and sitting in your breath, I think of that's where a lot of my writing comes from. And I think of us as bodies being a reflection of a wider society and nature. So I think of lungs as being tree branches. And if you look at nature, nothing in nature blooms all year long. So you shouldn't expect that of yourself. And I think that's a very nurturing way to think about our relationship with our bodies and our expectations on ourselves, and asking for that help. Because, say, with a tree, if there are parts of a tree or parts of a plant that aren't nurturing, you can prune those, you can cut those, you can replant those, and really thinking about how we can emulate a lot of that essence of nature within ourselves.
That's so beautiful. Kaya, there's loads of nature in your book too. So if Charlotte is introducing this concept of the body as nature, the lungs as branches, rejuvenation, photosynthesis, you spend so much of your book in the water in different ways, or talking about the water, and also your thoughts on climate are in there. Is the planet another body in your book? Does that concept resonate with you?
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. I guess, when you start to connect, when the brain in the jar starts to connect with the body, starts to connect with the community, starts to connect with the world, you can't, you can't escape it, and you can't choose what you do and what you are a part of and what you're not a part of. So yeah, like I guess when you start to have those holistic feelings, you start to feel that sense of connection, but also the sense of responsibility. And these are all ideas that have been passed down through millennia. It's all part of every spiritual practice, religious practice, indigenous cultures. And I just feel a bit slow that it took me this long to kind of get there, and it's not necessarily something we teach in the same way anymore. And like, I'm a professional scientist, and any kind of notion of spirituality or connection in these sort of what are viewed as very sort of nebulous or like not serious concepts, and I think
Yeah,
probably
even sort
the
of
most
Gaia theory
important.
that's been around for 40 or 50 years, is still kind of seen as fringe science, whereas that's the basis of most human cultures, is that the earth is a living thing. I think it's very interesting
Yeah.
that we're all sort of, that there's so many stories now about queer understandings of the body coming around at the same time as we're sort of dealing with the consequences of living in the Anthropocene. And I think there's definitely a connection between the climate crisis and our understandings of ourselves in this way. A roundabout way of turning everything into a conversation about climate change. Sorry.
But absolutely.
This is
But I'm
really good.
interested in, like, do we think that is a helpful way of interrogating what is happening? Or as queer writers, is that the only way we know how? Like, we can't all be a tsunami scientist like Kaya, but how are we... Is that a way that we're making sense of it? Is there a way that we can create more change? Does that resonate with you, Jennifer? Or is it just like impending doom, must write?
No, I definitely see fiction as transformative, and the purpose of fiction is to transform and to excite and to expand people's imaginative possibilities. And that's definitely my job in the world, best job in the world. It's a really slow way to go about fixing the climate crisis. So I also write a bunch of nonfiction and do some activist stuff. But I do think that interrogating this kind of what we think of as human, or what we think of as worthy of care, and all these sort of questions are extremely urgent problems.
Emma, you've been doing lots of nodding. Are those concepts resonating with you? How does that feel coming to us from Aotearoa today?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that feels very hard about the climate crisis is just the ongoing doom, right? And so I think that for me, part of connecting with a better future, it is thinking about, the world as a body, as care, is how we do better, and caring for that body, as well as how I do better in caring for my own body and the bodies of, I think in my book there's a poem about one of my nibblings who, I was having a Zoom call with them, and they'd drawn a picture of their brother, and I just could not stop thinking about how there wasn't enough water in the world for this tiny little person to go on existing, and all of those tensions, right? But that love and joy and access to that is I think maybe a more powerful human motivator than doom, like for me, definitely, I'm looking forward to trying to find a way to still have tenderness and joy, even in a world that's very different, or is soon going to be very different,
That makes me think about your work too, Charlotte, that idea of tenderness. Before we start moving to Q&A, which we will do really soon, so for anyone on the call, absolutely start thinking about the questions that you might like to ask these panelists. I wanted to touch briefly on form, and the form in which you are writing, the tools that gives you to talk about your body. We've got a novelist, fiction is transformatist, we've got a memoirist, poets. Emma, how does poetry feel to you when you're writing about your body? Does that feel like the right tool for you?
Yes. I mean, I've been writing poetry since, I don't know, maybe when do you first start writing poetry? You're 5 or you're 8? Like, I don't even remember departing from writing it. So, and in some ways, every time I'm writing, I feel like I'm writing poetry, which makes everything else that I have to write, like funding applications or business writing, kind of situation. So yeah, poetry. I mean, I'm really fussy about my form. I'm sure that you've noticed that lots of the poems in my book are really blocky, and they're kind of like, in some ways, also a bit rejecting form. I'm really light on punctuation because I like confusion. I like asking the reader to figure out how they feel about things. Yeah, I don't
They
know.
look big on the page. Like, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but your poems look
No, that's
big on the
okay.
page. Like, there is a weight to the way your poems
Yes.
look,
Which
which
is
I
really
really enjoy
nice.
engaging with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
they're pretty poems. It's great. And yeah, I was actually extremely confronted when I got the book and I was flicking through it and I was going, wow, it's a really large number of words in there. So yeah, I didn't really realize that my poems were really wordy before that. Like, if you'd asked me, I wouldn't have known. But yeah. Anyway, I'm in a
Confronting
lifelong love
your
affair
own
with
I was just going to say, sorry, the delay's tricky, but I was going to say you're confronting your own internalized fat phobia about the size of your poems on the page.
Absolutely. And like, as a fatty taking up space, it's like contentious. It's like, am I on the bus? Am I like taking up too much of the other person's seat? Or like, in the airline, can I do, it's all those experiences over and over. In the book, I was like, wow, I've written this really fat book. Great.
If poetry is the thing for Emma and that is a form where they find weight in their poetry, Kaya, what did writing a memoir that was so structured mean to you? Because each of the chapters feel to be a really similar length. They each have their own themes. Like, there was also a structure for you to hang your relationship with your body on.
Yeah, look, I originally wrote it as like 1,000 word essays that I wrote like one a week. And then I was like, wow, no, I need to turn this into a thing, And I appreciate you saying that it's structured, because that's not, people don't often make that observation, and they are like roughly 5,000 words. And I was also learning how to write, and I was learning how to like create an artistic form that worked for me, and I was finding my voice. And so this is the book I had to write. Like, I had to do it, and in the end, I enjoyed the form, and that was something I really felt became my own, and that was, I guess, important. I'm not going to be limited to it in the future. I've got all sorts of ideas that follow different formats. So yeah, it was good.
Good. I'm glad it was good. I think there's something in that freedom through structure. Jennifer, we were talking before a little bit about that concept of taking up space. Does that resonate with you, or is your transformative work about different worlds and going somewhere different? Like, it's something Emma and I are really familiar with in that fat world, but do you care about that idea of taking up space?
Oh, absolutely. And it's something I was very aware of writing The Airways. Yun's chapters are very, very, there's a lot of white space. There's a lot of fragments, especially as they begin in their new sort of form and discovering what they are and what they're capable of. There's a lot of blank space, and then gradually it looks more like prose. And I was aware of giving the reader a lot of space and not a lot of information to begin with. So I wanted the reader to be thrown into this experience and to be as oriented and as lost as the character was. And then to have this very slow, gradual sort of gathering of data and energy from the world around them, so that they could go through what Yun was going through. This idea of sort of taking up space in the world is also quite central to the novel. The theme of ghosting is there in Adam, the other protagonist's life. He takes up space. He's not aware of boundaries that other people have. He doesn't respect them. He doesn't take responsibility for his actions. He does some damage in the world, and he's not held accountable for it by the world. And I was really interested in this kind of like freeloading masculinity kind of character, because he was a familiar guy to me. I didn't like living with him for several years, but he was very comfortable taking up space in the world in a way that I'm not. It was interesting to be in his head.
And taking up like he was taking up space in the world, but he was also taking up space in your life. How do you say goodbye, or how do you farewell, or how do you exhume a character like that from your space and your mind?
Just give him to other people to read.
Thanks.
Amazing. He's awful. You have him. We're getting to the last 10, 12 or so minutes of this discussion today. So I wanted to really encourage any questions that anybody who is joining us today might have for these panelists. And while we warm up on that, was there anything any of you wanted to ask each other? I've done a lot of talking, but what curiosities have you had about each other's work? Kaya, was there anything that you wanted to ask anybody here?
Well, I would really love to see the poets perform, but I think it's a bit much to ask for the last 10 minutes. I'll be looking it up. I'm sure there's stuff on YouTube.
Yeah, I think that is officially rude, putting poets on the spot. Dance, monkey dance. Do your thing.
Coming from you saying dance, monkey dance, for me, writing poetry is like your words are dancing. So it's sometimes it's a really structured piece, and sometimes it's a freestyle kind of thing, and it's just about moving through those words.
Yeah,
That's
I love
so
that
beautiful.
connection of the physicality to the words. I think that's a really exciting part of poetry.
Hey, Kaya, we've got a question for you. Somebody's saying, how did you get publishers interested in publishing your memoir? And this question asker has said, I thought most publishers weren't interested in queer memoir. What's the magic trick?
I got an agent. Someone else did it. I mean, my agent is Jane Novak. She's incredible. She's been unbelievably supportive, and I'm so grateful for her in this. I don't think I would have got published without her. And she just knew, she's got a real measure of like who is who in publishing and who you are. And she's like a sort of matchmaker of dreams, like, so I was very lucky to have that. And once she took me on, I was sort of in safe hands, and she made it happen, basically. Yeah.
But what does the before bit look like before finding your matchmaker? So if the answer is get an agent, how do you do that?
So I met her in person. So that was how I was able to do it. I also had to ask. So, to say, hey, I've got something. Do you reckon you can take it on? And she said yes. So that was great for me. I guess when I wrote, I never expected to be published, so I had to kind of write it anyway. She also gave me advice along the way. I think with her, you just send her an email. And I think with all agents, that's what you do. I think you can get advice on writing your letter, like your sort of pitch kind of thing, and that's really important. These people are really busy, so if you can have work that you're happy with, get to the best you can, write a good cover letter, ask people for advice, see if it's going to capture something, and then send it. And like, I think one of the worst things you can do is say, oh, I'm not going to write this thing because no one's interested in it. You need for a good thing, to write a good book or to write a good thing, you have to believe in what you're doing. So if you don't believe in it, no one else will. So like, just you've got to choose a project that's like, so Charlotte Wood calls it like heat seeking. It's got to be something that you're passionate about, and then that will come through. And then like, good luck. That's the other thing you need. I think. Yeah.
Hey, Emma, you have had 2 books published this year. One, your poetry collection is already out, I Am in Bed with You, and Out Here is coming out next week. Emma now does product placement of the book that is coming out next week. What does that process look like for you? Like, is it never rains but it pours? You've had lots of poetry published in places, but all of a sudden you've now got 2 books?
Yeah, and for me, it's actually a real 180-degree switch around. I've been anti-book for a long time, which sounds weird as a writer, but I think that particularly with poetry, there's no money in it. It's an attention economy. not always the right people get the books. And for a long time, I just sort of didn't see the type of people I wanted having books to have books. So I sort of abstained. And then Chris Teese, my co-editor, invited me into his project. So I didn't come up with the idea. I just worked with him over the last almost 3 years to put it together. And out of that process, the managing editor at the press was like, why don't you have a book? And had lots of chats with me about, well, you could have a book. And I was like, but I don't want a book. And then he was like, but it's ridiculous that you don't have a book. And I was like, and I think I also do really want a book, obviously. So like it was a big tension there for me, and I thought about it a lot. And then I just sort of, I went, I'm saying no too much. Like maybe I should just give in and see what it's like. So
I
yeah,
wish I was that cool. Oh my god.
I don't know if it's about being cool. I think
I
it's
was
about
like,
being in the
please
right
publish
place in the
my
right
book.
time. Yeah, I know. And I acknowledge that that's an experience that does not happen to anybody. And there's a huge amount of privilege. And even just Chris actually championing me and connecting me up to the press, like none of that was me. That was all Chris, who, deserves a lot of credit in this whole situation. Yeah.
You've both mentioned being championed and having somebody believe in you, but also believing in yourself. We've got a follow-up question to that. Can you recommend any publishers or magazines who are sympathetic to queer fiction and non-fiction? Jennifer, does that resonate with you? But then anyone feel free to jump in.
I've had a lot to do with Overland over the years. I was their fiction editor for 4 years, maybe 6 years. They publish a lot of really great queer fiction online and in the magazine, so I would hit them up, definitely. Meanjin are pretty good. The Saturday Paper publishes fiction, and they pay quite well. Archer magazine, I don't know if they publish fiction, but they're obviously home for a lot of queer readers. That's off the top of my head. There's plenty more. But yeah, in terms of fiction, I reckon Overland and Meanjin are the good journals to be submitting work to. There's also other literary journals that are very sympathetic to queer fiction. I think most of them actually are. They're just sympathetic to good fiction. Like being queer isn't enough. It has to also be good writing.
I love that answer as well. Another question coming through. How do you feel about putting out work about your body to all of the panelists? Is it vulnerable or empowered? Were you ever scared of the reaction? Kaya, I'll throw that to you first because there is so much of yourself and your body in your memoir. How did you feel?
Yeah, it's totally terrifying. You have to. But you also have to be really psychologically prepared, I think, and know your boundaries when you do media and that sort of thing. You need to be at peace with it before it happens. I think, you're going to get people making judgments on it, and you need to be able to separate that judgment from yourself. Yeah, I guess it was empowering in the sense, what's the nicest thing is that, like, friends, I was scared about people reading it that knew me, and it's really been a source of connection with friends, and that was an unexpected and delightful kind of outcome. Yeah.
What about you, Charlotte? How do you feel when you have an essay coming out or you're about to stand in front of an audience and share that part of your core? How does it feel to you when you do that?
I think there definitely is a level of vulnerability, but I do find being on that stage so much easier, or writing something easier than having those small conversations. So I actually wrote about the experience of my mother is Filipino, and there being a queer history within that Filipino culture. And I wrote for the SBS before I had that conversation with my mother about that. So I found it easy to do it in those bigger spaces because whilst it is vulnerable, it doesn't necessarily have to feel as intimate, but it also, again, feels like a sounding board to see, am I prepared for how this might work?
And did you talk to your mother about it after your piece was published, or
I still haven't
mentioned
that
interesting.
One. She knows I'm queer. My mum has gone for fundraisers for they provide gender diverse because she was like, in their heart, they're not who they feel and who they are. And this was well before I'd even come out as bisexual to my mother. And I'm like, how are you so on top of this? But we still haven't had that conversation. explicitly, but it's just knowing that I kind of don't have to, because that acceptance and that awareness and that nurturing is there. So trying to embody that part within myself and how I present and how I support people as well.
That's beautiful. And in some ways, you have the control over the narrative as well, right?
Yeah.
Like it's your piece. Does that resonate with you, Emma? Like how do you feel having such pieces of intimate parts of your thoughts and brain out there in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, confronting experience having a book, but because it's a much more official, having 1 or 2 poems in a journal over like 15 years, like nobody's connecting the dots on it. But when it's a book, it's like, oh, they're all there and there are all the themes. And I think I really just shut my eyes and go with it, in part because I've spent my entire reading life like transporting myself into the body of whatever protagonist I'm reading about. And I just kind of wanted there to be a book for, people like me, if that makes sense, and I do write a lot about sex. And I think for fat people, especially, writing about sex is very important. We're hypersexualized or desexualized, and I kind of want to get in that mid area where it's okay to just do it. Yeah.
A lot of these, this conversation has been about the putting something very personal out there, but I wanted to touch on your work, Jennifer, and how you feel about that, because it's personal, but also it's fiction, so it's transformative. What does it feel like to you before a novel comes out?
Well, this is my 5th book, so I'm getting used to it now, but it's always very vulnerable. They're always very kind of raw and exposed, and I don't usually let people read my work until it's in the editing process, basically. So yeah, I did have a couple of sensitivity readers on this one, but I'm very protective of my process. I don't sort of like to think a lot about how a book's going to be received. And then usually once I've finished it and it's with the publisher, then I start to panic. But then there's such a long lag with fiction. There's usually at least 6 months between a book being accepted and the editing and production process is so long that by the time the book comes out, you really separate yourself from it in a way, and it's like it's a thing that happened to you almost. Like, I can't remember why it frightened me anymore.
That would have been an interesting thing to go into more, is depending on the form you're using to write about your body, the panic is different. Very last question, and Kaya, I want you to answer this one really quickly, because then we'll need to wrap up. But when you write something so personal, but you don't know whether it's going to make it to print, who is your imagined audience? Is it a queer audience you're imagining sharing that with, or are you writing for you?
I think you have to write for yourself first, because you're not going to get that validation. If you need the validation, like, you're not going to get it. Is it primarily queer oriented? I care most about what queer people think, but I like to be an inclusive. I like it to be I like it to be an invitation rather than a kind of exclusive experience.
That's beautiful. Write for yourself, but it's an invitation. It was almost quick enough, but I just speeded it up a little bit more for you at the end there. Thank you so much to everybody today. I feel like we could probably talk for 5 more hours about our bodies and our brains and our webs and what that means to us, and also what it means to all of the readers. But I think we are going to need to wrap this session up. So thank you so much to Kaya, to Emma, to Charlotte, to Jennifer. Thank you to the team at EnQueer, and thank you to everybody who is here today. This has been Body of Work, a celebration of writing about queer bodies. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.